This program is about what may turn out to be the greatest change to the way we live in human history. I want to talk about the end of scarcity, that is, the limited availability at any one time in the past of what it was we needed or thought we needed, and about how the end of scarcity is coming in about 50 years or so. So, after that apocalyptic start, let's hope you're still listening. Now, I suppose I've spent most of my working life looking at the way scarcity, in whatever form it takes, acts as a spur to innovation, and how innovation, in turn, triggers change, much of it as unintended consequences, and how, in spite of all that innovation, somehow today we've ended up living in a world where scarcity still drives things along, with poverty and disease and inequality and other bad stuff. But maybe not for much longer. So let me state the obvious and go from there. They always say, don't they, necessity is the mother of invention. 5,000 years ago, the lack of means to manage agricultural output triggered the invention of writing and arithmetic. In the 17th century, the new voyages of exploration were short of financial backing till the bright idea of capitalism and selling shares in the profit. And as for those unintended consequences, I like the story of the typewriter, invented to deal with the shortage of scribblers needed to handle the explosion of commercial paperwork in 19th century America. The typewriter did the trick okay, by bringing women out of the kitchen and into the newly invented typing pool, which then boosted the divorce rate. If you think about it, the way innovation has dealt with scarcity has acted like a kind of evolutionary stimulus to human society. What could be more evolutionary than doing your best to get better at ensuring survival? So innovation has been an ongoing part of life since the start, because there's never been a time when there was totally enough of everything to go around. So the mantra has always been the same one that the great 19th century inventor Thomas Edison would tell his backroom boys: there's a better way, find it. And of course, each innovation changed to some extent the way we lived and expressed ourselves. I mean, for instance, think about life before and after the invention of social media. And you can see how innovating to deal with scarcity has gradually through history built up the behavior patterns and values by which we live in the modern world. I mean, that same 5,000 years ago, good agricultural land was so scarce, they invented the institution of marriage to make sure property got handed on in the same family. Government itself was invented to keep things stable by ensuring that at least some of the wealth got shared around. Today, in our value system, if something's scarce, it's valuable. As a result, there are inevitably the haves and have-nots. Now, looking back, I suppose there were two scarcity-handling innovations above all that stand out because of the way they so fundamentally changed everybody's lives. The first one happened because tin became scarce. See, by mid-18th century, the 600 tin mines in Cornwall were producing half the tin in Europe, which meant lots of Cornish jobs and lots of Cornish wages. And because everybody used pewter plates and drinking cups, and pewter is mostly tin, lots of Cornish profits. But as they dug deeper and farther out under the sea, there was also lots of Cornish flooding and a growing shortage of tin. Which is why the Glasgow University repairman was hanging around looking into the matter and eventually coming up with the answer in the form of his new super-efficient steam-powered drainage pump. Did the job, and when its back-and-forth piston action was turned rotary, James Watt's pump became known as a steam engine and did more than drain. It kicked off the Industrial Revolution. Because now you didn't need rivers to drive watermills, you could put the new steam-powered factories next to their fuel source, the coalfields, and the new factory workers next to the factories. And before you knew it, there was mass production and the division of labour and shift work and regular wages and slums and smog and all that good stuff in the new industrial cities we all crowded into and in which we still live today. By around 1900, mass production and innovation meant we were heading for a future, at least in the industrialised nations, where people were enjoying basics that had previously been luxuries. Basics like health, a home, regular food, clothing, education, a job, maybe even an indoor toilet. The days of fundamental scarcity were gone. But the companies that had provided all those basics were starting to see market saturation and the end of the line for sales and profits if something weren't done pretty quick about it. So an American biscuit company came up with a great innovative concept. If there were no real basic scarcities left to deal with, then maybe it was time to make some up. The first attempt at this was by a new self-styled advertising agency in New York called N.W. Ayer. And the way they set the scene for all ads that followed was to persuade their potential customers that they needed the product, in this case a biscuit, thanks to the name they gave it. I'll spell the name. U-N-E-E-D-A. Unida. How subtle was that? You need a biscuit. And with a $1 million ad campaign in 1905, it worked. By the end of that year, they were selling 1 million biscuits a month and had to open a new factory to meet demand. Quick as a flash, everybody's salespeople began recruiting psychologists to tell them what to do to control and direct customer choice. And the first thing the shrinks all said was, stick to the eternal truth that what is scarce is valuable. So your sales pitch has to be, the product is scarce, so you'd better get it before others grab it. And use slogans like, while stocks last, limited offer, or you'll be the envy of others. These were the first years of what became known as scarcity economics, the concept that kept factories producing and selling and people in jobs. An economy based on the fact that human wants would always exceed limited resources, real or perceived. An economy ultimately driven by advertising. Boosted in 1927 by the first radio soap operas. So called because the first advertisers to use those little radio plays about what they called ordinary people who used the product were the soap companies.
The Guiding Light, presented by Duz, the soap that does everything in your washing machine, and Ivory Soap.
Now, today, all this scarcity-related persuasion that we've become used to seeing on billboards and in cinemas, TV, newspapers and magazines and so on is gradually shifting online, as we all do too. And here we're into an entirely new approach to perceived scarcity and promoting the desire for apparently scarce things, driven this time by the second of those major historical innovations I mentioned just now. This one happened back in World War II. The American military machine is going like gangbusters, producing more weapons than you can shake a stick at, which is fine for socking it to the enemy. But socking it how? I mean, it's rough, windy weather, raining cats and dogs, freezing cold, and the enemy is half a mile away and well dug in. To make sure you hit him, you look up in your little firing tables what angle to point your weapon in those particular weather conditions at that particular kind of target at that distance. Working out those little firing tables for every possible circumstance and every different kind of weapon involves millions of calculations. And at the Aberdeen, Maryland labs, where this stuff is going on, all they've got are 80 women mathematicians. These ladies are working night and day and not keeping up with demand. This is a really serious example of scarcity because we want to win the war. So some bright spark invents a machine to do all the sums electrically. This new gizmo becomes known by the name they had previously given to all those poor, overworked computational women. They decide to call it a computer. And here's another big unintended consequence, because those wartime noodlers had no idea what computers would end up doing to us, thanks to the ability the modern computer has for handling big numbers. We now call that big data. And big data makes possible entirely new ways to drive the scarcity economy along because of what big data can find out about you. Digital footprint's the key phrase here. It's a trail you leave behind every time you do anything online. Every time you click to activate something or agree to cookies or make any kind of purchase, provide any kind of information, download anything, use your bank or your passport, almost anything you do can be recorded and analyzed to find out about you and your likes and dislikes. And the reason the machine gets it right is because the data it collects is immense. 3 times every second, we generate the amount of data there is in the Library of Congress. So for big data, looking at what people get up to or want no longer involves statistical samples or representative numbers. This is everything. And there's now a whole new industry dedicated to telling you how to use all this data for what's called predictive analytics. You throw your algorithm into the sea of data about a person, and the algorithm looks for patterns in their behavior. So, for instance, because a computer in your smartphone always knows where you are, this can all be done in real time. So big data knows you're in that shop looking for whatever it is and can suggest to you via a message to your phone where to look. And then identify what else you might also be interested in on another shelf. Or it might predict where you'll go next and offer advice on that too. I'm not making this up. In the Seattle Amazon store, since last October, you just point your smartphone at the goods on the shelf, it reads the barcode and tells your bank to pay, and you just take the stuff and leave. No checkout. It's called Grab and Go. As it happens, that Amazon Grab and Go world was foreseen as far back as the late 1950s, when the Limits to Growth report by the Club of Rome announced that if we went on with business as usual, we would face economic and social collapse by the late 21st century. So far, they've been partly right. If you think about pollution, overpopulation, industrialization, starvation, disease, and above all, resource depletion, environmental degradation, and climate change, all now beginning to threaten our cozy consumerist lifestyle. The international political reaction to these latest scarcities has been a lot of talk about putting the brakes on fossil fuel use and cutting back on resources, as well as limits to urban expansion and industrialization in general. All severe impediments to the continuing economic growth we have enjoyed on and off up to now. So the Third World can no longer expect a brighter future, and the industrialized world faces possible major damage to their economies and things in general going down the drain. Apocalypse now, you might think. Fortunately, here comes the cavalry, in the form of those innovative thinkers again, one of whom got a Nobel Prize for his work, physicist Richard Feynman. In December 1959, Feynman said this:
"How small can you make machinery? It turns out to be possible, according to the laws of physics in principle, to build a computer in which each bit or each little piece of information is one atom large. There's plenty of room to make things very much smaller than we ever made them before."
So maybe the answer to resource depletion and all the other bad things lay in being able to make what we need from atoms and molecules, of which there are gazillions everywhere, an inexhaustible resource. No law of physics says we can't do that. Well, after Feynman, it took a while for the technology to get going, but then in 1981, a couple of IBMers invented the scanning tunneling microscope. Suffice to say, it lets you pick up atoms and put them together with other atoms to make molecules. Like, if you put 2 atoms of hydrogen, chemical symbol H, so 2 atoms is H2, together with 1 atom of oxygen, O, that makes H2O, water. I can't resist adding that if you also use carbon, that's C, you can come up with a more complex one. C22H18O10 plus C22H18O11 plus C15O14O6 plus C22H14O10 plus H2O plus C6H12O6. Know what all that makes? Sweet tea. If you could put all those molecules together, you could make a cuppa. Well, you'd need the formula to make the cup too. And of course you can transmit all that molecular information to any computer you want in a flash. So people have been getting on with trying to do that kind of thing in a new field that's become known as nanotechnology, the teeny-weeny, by which I mean a nanometer is a billionth of a meter. So the width of a human hair is, for example, 80,000 nanometers, 1 nanometer being about the width of 3 atoms. For nearly 20 years now, nanotechnologists in 2,000 labs around the world have been beavering away and have come up, so far, with about 2,000 nanoproducts. Nanoparticles are already in stuff like cosmetics, bacterial bandages, and wrinkle-free water-repellent clothing. And there are major nanoprocesses already working in the labs. Stick one end of a straw in filthy water and drink pure water out the other end. Spray-on solar cells that turn whatever you spray into its own solar power source. Molecular filters to take all the pollutant out of exhausts and smokestacks. So if this stuff is going to be on the market in the next 15 years, maybe there's no need for the global economy-busting Armageddon we are planning at present. There's little doubt that the marvels of nanotechnology could allow us to consumerize all 8 billion people on Earth in one giant, ever-growing market economy and perhaps not destroy the environment in doing so. Except for the apocalyptic pronouncement I made at the start of this program. The thing that's going to change absolutely everything. And again, I'm not making this up. Even those sober-sides at MIT agree it's coming. Well, they're working flat out to make it happen.
What we're doing, ultimately, you can think of it as the roadmap to the replicator. In Star Trek, the thing that could make anything. But really, more precisely, you can think about it as merging communication and computation with fabrication to bring the programmability of the digital world out here into the physical world. So I'm Neil Gershenfeld, and I direct the Center for Bits and Atoms at MIT, and I chair the Fab Foundation. What's going to happen is you go forward with this roadmap actually isn't changing what you can make as much as what you need to make it. The next step is to digitize not the designs, that happened in 1952 with the first NC mill, but to actually digitize the materials. So that's not a new idea, that's 4 billion years old. That's the evolutionary age of the replicator, literally, that makes you. And it builds you out of just 20 parts called the amino acids. What we're coming to understand is you can reduce essentially all of modern technology down to about 20 properties, like conducting, insulating, rigid, flexural. And then by making these building blocks out of that small set of properties, you can add them together to reproduce the range of modern technology. And so the research leading up to the replicator on assemblers works just the same that works, but instead of being limited by biological materials, we're using technological materials. So you go through the lab here, you'll see bits of everything I'm describing. And so it's really a question of how fast it gets out of the lab.
I mean, when you want to manipulate things at nanoscale, you do have to be in basements in the hole. Everything above ground is susceptible to the vibrations of the world around it, like a bus going over a speed.
My name's Grace Copplestone. I'm from Bristol in the UK, but currently I'm working as a master's student at the Centre for Bits and Atoms at MIT. Your tweezer trying to pick up that atom will go too far and it won't be able to pick it up. So actually, I think basements may be where the replicators are created. This is a femtosecond laser, and this is really going to enable us to start cutting things into metal that are reaching the scale of nanometers. So that's like 0.000000001 meters.
The roadmap to the replicator means you can have a self-reproducing machine that can make anything out of a small set of parts. And so in one sense, we're talking about basic science many years in the future. But when that's done, you'll be able to make what you can already make today just without all of the advanced inputs.
This is a big branch of the research that we do here, which is really looking at how we can decompose physical form into a kit of parts. So here we see a part that can conduct electricity, a part that can not conduct electricity, and we have a part that can move backwards and forwards. Each part is probably about 5 millimeters big. To my left, there's another example of this where we've shrunken down each of these parts so that it's 1 millimeter large. We're able to start shrinking down physical form to the point in which we're actually manipulating individual atoms. But we're starting at a scale where we can actually see them.
Today, you can do it at a factor of 1,000 to the smallest building block. In a decade or two, it'll be a factor of 1 million. In a few decades, a factor of 1 billion. In a sense, the replicator is here today. Every year, it's going to need fewer inputs to do it. It's going to get faster, better, cheaper, and smaller. But it's a mistake to wait for the replicator. It's happening now.
The replicator, the nanotech holy grail, is more commonly known as a personal nanofactory, and it will make anything you want. Depending on what size stuff you want to make, the factory can either come as a desktop box or something bigger sitting in your garden shed or garage. Putting together a nanofactory would require us to be able to build trillions of atomic-scale robots to work on an atomic-scale production line, taking atoms and putting them together so as to make molecules, and then doing the same to the molecules so as to make stuff, and then shaping that stuff into things. Things like food, clothing, construction materials, electronics, the bits and pieces of daily life, pretty much anything made from atoms and molecules, which is everything, right? And all to be fabricated in no time, since down at the nano level, things happen 1,000,000 times faster than up here at the us level. And the raw materials you'd use? Dirt, air, and tap water, and a bit of cheap carbon-rich stuff like acetylene gas. So costs would be minimal. And once you're up and running, you can make your own acetylene gas and water. So no cost, even for energy, which would be solar. Science fiction? Well, the first atomic-scale factory robot has just been built in Manchester.
My name's David Lee. I'm a Royal Society research professor at the University of Manchester, and what my research group and I work on is the ultimate in miniaturization, that is, trying to design and make molecular machines. What we've managed to do is to actually create the most sophisticated molecular robot yet, and it's built up of about 150 atoms, and what it's able to do is to manipulate other molecular structures just in the same way as a robot on a factory assembly line. Our molecular robot is able to manipulate molecular size structures and add atoms and clusters of atoms in exactly the right places that we want and produce different structures depending upon how we program it. This latest one is a real breakthrough in that it's actually able to build new kinds of molecules and different molecules depending upon how you program it. We've been building for the last 15, 20 years on trying to learn how to get molecules to manipulate other molecules with ever-increasing complexity. And in fact, I was awarded the Feynman Prize for Nanotechnology back in 2007 for our work on being able to make machines that can be powered by light and chemical fuels. So it all comes back to Feynman, his visionary lecture. There's plenty of room at the bottom that's inspired a generation of scientists, including myself. We owe the guy a great debt.
So if the nanofactory is really on its way, and with unintended consequences in mind, what will its first social effects likely be? Well, it makes no waste, so you'd have no carbon footprint pollution to worry about. You'd be free to live cleanly anywhere because you'd be totally autonomous, with all the resources, atoms and molecules, you might ever need. On previously worthless but perhaps wild and beautiful land, up some mountain or in a desert or Antarctica if you like. And you'd be looked after by the other major thing nanotechnology will have produced, nanocomputers, each one artificially intelligent and at least 100,000 times more powerful than today's supercomputer, and each the size of a mote of dust.
All this goes into a volume of material 1/200th of an inch on a side, which is the smallest piece of dust that you can possibly see.
Maybe we'll call them motes. Embedded in or sprayed on everything, from your walls to your skin, and Wi-Fi networked with the trillions of other motes everywhere on the planet. Once you tell your motes what you want, you'll talk to them, of course, they program your physical world for you any way you choose. So make your house interior look like Versailles today, or a country cottage tomorrow. And given that the motes would also be programming your nanofactory to make whatever you want, you could live a life of what used to be called unbelievable luxury. Have your granny or all your pals round to a slap-up dinner, they'll come as 3D holograms, so realistic you'll forget they're not real. So you'd never be lonely, or bored, or lack for anything. Sounds like winning the lottery, right? Well, yes and no. Start with the fact that the first thing a nanofactory could make would be another nanofactory. So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 1 for everybody on the planet in, say, 2 years. You send a nanofactory to every country or region or city or village, and they make all the extra ones they need on the spot. And as for the instructions for what the nanofactory does, well, the motes program all that, because encoding instructions for doing or making anything from clothing to cake would be, well, a piece of cake. So from then on, whatever you want, you make. So what happens to all those retailers you used to buy from? And the manufacturers or service industries who supply them? And the jobs they all provide? Because if you don't need to buy anything anymore, what need would there be for money? Or a job? What about the taxes collected on all those wages? By a government now with no purpose, since all governments ever did was decide how to spend our tax money on the infrastructure. Education and health? Well, the motes, controlling the nanomedical devices and medications you can now make at home, take care of your health. As for education, education for what? In today's world, with robots threatening to take all today's jobs, the talk is of educating people to be creative. But creative how? And for what purpose? And then, how do people define themselves without work? And if everybody lives either by themselves or in very small communities, what happens to the culture we used to share? Or was that just a stage in our evolution? Because we will no longer have to group together to survive, will we? And what will hologram socializing do to human contact? Indeed, human reproduction. Or take the values we espouse. If nothing is scarce, does anything have value? In the final analysis, you can see how all those millennia of being good at innovating our way out of scarcity, and in doing so, building a society organized so as to provide as many people as possible with what it was they needed, is all suddenly put to question by the advent of abundance. We have no experience in dealing with abundance, and we may have no more than 50 years till it hits, till the first nanofactories happen and force us into the chaotic and profoundly disruptive transition from thousands of years of one way of living to a new and entirely unknown way. The transition to what you might call the next stage of social evolution, as a social animal with no need to be social anymore. Who knows, given the enormity of this potentially catastrophic or potentially utopian change, it might be worth considering some kind of international project to prepare and plan for it, don't you think? Of course, you may feel that everything I've said has been a figment of my fevered imagination, and that you can now switch off and forget it because it's just not going to happen. Well, even if only some of it happens, surely we ought at least to think about it. If only to avoid finding ourselves in the position of the man in the joke who falls off a skyscraper, and as he's dropping past the 50th floor, he's asked how he's doing, shrugs his shoulders and says, "Hey, so far, so good."